everybody, it's Courtney. Today I'm creating a card using the Alpaca Holiday stamp set by Sunny Studio, and I'm going to be creating a scene here. So I'm starting off with a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm just going to be doing my background first here. So I'm stamping this little mountain range using my grid mat just to make sure it's straight across my card panel. Now this doesn't completely fit, so I'm going to have to stamp this twice. So I'm masking out the first little mountain range here, and then I'll stamp that again off to the right and then mask that out again. We're going to be doing a little bit of ink blending in the background before we actually color our images. So for the sky, I'm going to be using 2 different colors of Distress Oxides, using Stormy Sky and Tumbled Glass. I had a few little smudges here, so I just very lightly went over with a sand eraser to kind of take those smudges up. Going to start off with the Tumbled Glass on the very top part of the panel, work my way down towards those mountains. Then I'll go in with my Stormy Sky for the very top, then blend that back out with the Tumbled Glass. And I went back and forth a few times just to make sure I got good coverage and a good blend. Now you can go down as far as you want. I ended up going right down to my mountain ranges, but you can leave a little bit of white space if you want a little bit of a highlight there. For my snow, or for the, yeah, I guess it would be the snow. I'm taking a piece of Eclipse masking paper, and most of this is going to be covered up, so this part would be completely optional. But I'm just cutting a curve here with some Eclipse masking paper, and I'll lay that down on just random areas onto my snow, mask out the bottom so that my ink blending tool doesn't go beyond where I want it to. This time I'm using regular Distress inks. I find this technique is a little bit easier with the regular Distress inks rather than the oxides. This is Shaded Lilac, and I'm pretty much just going over the mask itself with just a teeny tiny bit of the blending tool going onto the card panel. I want this to be super subtle. This is just to kind of create some dimension in the background to make it appear as if there are snowy hills in the background. And I just kept moving this mask all over the place to kind of just create that texture. Like I said, most of this is going to be covered up and it's not going to be seen too well anyway. Now, when I saw this stamp set, I have a friend who is obsessed with alpacas. She's trying to talk her husband into letting her get one. So this Christmas card will definitely be going to her. I'm not sure if she watches my videos, but Amanda, this is the card you're getting for Christmas. So once I had all of my ink blending done, I'll go ahead and put my panel aside before I remove my mask. That way it'll give some time for that Distress Oxide to dry. Next, I'm going to be stamping out my images onto another piece of Neenah Solar White, and I'm stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is Copic safe. Starting off by stamping these 2 little alpacas that already have their little accessories or hats on. Then I'm going to stamp this hat onto my card panel as well as onto a piece of full stick Post-it note. And I'm just cutting off the bottom because that's the only part that actually needs to be masked. I'll go ahead and mask that out, and then I'll stamp my little alpaca below it, underneath it, to make it look as if he's wearing this little hat. Then when you remove the mask, it's 1 image rather than 2. I'm also going to stamp a couple of these little presents. The one I didn't get a great impression because apparently I was in a rush and didn't bother to make sure my stamp was inked. So I'll just stamp that again and just ignore that one that doesn't have great coverage. So onto the coloring. I'm starting off with my lightest color and mapping out my darkest areas, creating a shadow on his little face and underneath his scarf. And to add some texture to his, I don't know if this is fur or whatever it is, we're going to do just little C's, little curvy lines, especially on either side where the image kind of has those scalloped edges. This will be where these little puffy marks are on his body. So I'm just extending those areas out with these little C marks. Going in with the darkest color and pretty much just going over the areas that I had mapped out. I did add a few little curvy lines or little C's in the center of his little body too, on his belly, just to give a little added dimension and texture. Next, I'll go in with my mid-tone color here, which is the W3, and I'm just going directly over those little C's that we had created, making them a little bit thicker and a little bit longer. And then finally going back in with my lightest color and blending all of those areas, the solid areas out in the shadow, and just going over those little C's again. I'm not going to fill in the entire image on this one. I'm just going to create those C's and leave some white space. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up a little bit because I pretty much colored the other two the same way, but with just different color combinations. Throughout the entire card, all I used was three color combination. So again, starting off with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas for the shadows underneath the scarf and underneath his little hat, and then making those little C marks. Going in with the darkest color, going over those same areas again and creating those little C's, and you can go up or down or to the side with these C's. It doesn't really matter, just as long as you get that texture. Now, the three colors that I chose for this particular one were very similar to one another. So even after I went in with my lightest color, it was just, there was too much white space for the colors that I had chosen. So I ended up bringing in an E50 and just quickly going over the entire image to kind of blend these areas out, and that way it's not left completely white. For this next one, I'm going to use a different color combination for this, but again, coloring it the same exact way, creating a shadow on his little face and underneath and on the side of this little blanket or saddle or whatever it is. Going in with my darkest color, going over those darkest areas and creating those shadows and the little C's with the sides of him as well as in the center, blending that out with my mid-tone, and then finally going in with the lightest color and just going over those same areas again. I did color him in solid as well with the lightest color just to kind of give him some added texture there. Next, we'll move on to some of these little accessories that they have here. And I wanted to keep my color scheme a little bit lighter. I didn't want to have like a bright red and a bright green. So my lightest color here is an R20, which is definitely a pink. My darkest color is going to be an R24, which is more of a red. My darkest areas for this little hat are going to be on the bottom part of it. And I'm just doing a small little flick there where it's kind of bent over, blending that out with the R20 and then back to the blending that out with the R22 and then back to the R20. For this little scarf, the shading would be on either side of where it's kind of flipped around and hanging down. And then on those little areas that are hanging down, that would also create a shadow there. I did add a little bit, or I did keep a little bit of a highlight to the left side of that one little part that's hanging down so that I didn't have two dark areas directly next to one another. For this other little alpaca that has the striped scarf, I'm just going to do every other stripe red and green. And these are teeny tiny areas, so you don't have to do any shading here, but I did. For the vertical lines, I just did my shading on the top and bottom, and for the horizontal, I just did it on either side and just kept a center highlight. That's usually the easiest way to color images, especially when you're popping them up and it's not a one-layer scene. I don't usually worry about a light source. For the little presents here, the shading on the boxes would be underneath the lid of the box and then on either side, because like I said, we have a center light source here, but using that same color combination for my reds. For the ribbon and the bows, I'm just putting a little bit of shading on the bottom and on the top of the ribbon, and then where the bow is kind of gathered up and tied, and blending that out with the mid-tone and lightest color as well. We'll move on to the greens, and I started with one combination and then I kind of switched it up a little bit just because I wasn't getting the contrast I was looking for. But I'm starting off with this little blanket that's on the back of this alpaca here. My shading would be on either side. Center light source would be highlight in the center. And I'm using a YG07, but after I colored this particular image, I switched that out for a YG06 just to get a little bit more contrast. For this little hat, the only shading that I'm actually doing is on the base of it, And for the little stripes on this scarf, I'm doing my shading the same way as I did with my reds, being on either side or on top and bottom for the vertical lines. And here's where I ended up switching out to that YG06, and I just got a little bit more contrast than I did with the YG07. For the little gift packages here, coloring them the same way as I did with the reds. For this little present here, there wouldn't be much of a highlight just because this is behind the other gift. So that gift would be casting a shadow on the one in the back. So there's going to be very little highlight here. But use the same color combination as I did for the hat and the scarf. And for the ribbon on the top present here, I did my shading the same way as I did with the reds on the first one, just doing a little bit of shading on the top and bottom of the ribbon and in the center of the little bow. Now for the other gifts, I wanted to make these kind of like a golden yellow. So I'm doing the shading the same way as I did with the reds and the greens, starting off with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas, which will be on the bottom of the packaging and underneath that little lid. Moving on to the Y38, which is more of an orangey color, but it does blend well with the rest of the Y markers. Blending that out with the Y35 and then back to the Y02. For the little white areas on their hats, I'm just doing a little bit of shading with my C3 and my C1, just putting a few little flicks on either side with the C3, blending that out with the C1 until it fades to white. That way it'll still appear white, but you do have a little bit of shading, and this part is completely optional. For the little boots on this alpaca, I'm keeping my C markers out here, starting with my C7, just leaving a highlight on the one side of the little boots and where the boots are kind of raised up a little bit where his toes would be, keeping my highlight there. Next, I'll bring out a gel pen. This is just a white gel pen, and I'm just going to add some details. I'm going to add some polka dots to some areas, some stripes to some other areas, just to kind of give it some added interest. I'll also add a few little highlights on some of their hats and their scarves, just to make it look as if the light is creating a reflection. So once all of my images were colored, I did go ahead and fussy cut these out, especially you can use the matching dies, but being I kind of altered that one with the hat, I did end up fussy cutting these out with just a white border. Now for my card panel itself, I forgot that I had to color these mountains, so I carefully removed my masks, and you just want to do this carefully so that you don't tear your paper. And for the snow on the top of the mountains, I'm using a V22 and a V20, and this is kind of a close match to that shaded lilac. Starting off with my darkest color just on the base of that snow, flicking that out with the V20, and then I'll take my colorless blender really quickly and go from the opposite direction, so the top of the mountain down, just to get rid of some of those flick lines. For the mountains themselves, I'm going to start off with my lightest color and just map out my darkest areas, and that will be underneath the snow. Also, that would cast a shadow on the mountains that are behind the others, so the ones in the back would naturally be darker. Then I'll go in with my darkest color and go over those same areas, then blend that out with my mid-tone and then back to my lightest color. I flip my card panel around because for me, it's just easiest to flick away from me, but do whatever works for you. I do sometimes flick both directions, but I do find it easier. I feel like I have more control if I'm flicking away from me. Now, I didn't go over the shadows that I had created for the mountains that are behind the other ones with my mid-tone, just because these colors are so similar that I didn't want to lose that shadow. So I skipped that blending, and I'll just blend it out with my lightest color. Next, I'm going to just kind of arrange my little characters here to see how I'm going to want them on my card panel to decide where I wanted to stamp my sentiment. So these are pretty much going to take off the entire bottom part of the panel where the snow is. So I decided to place my sentiment in my sky. Now, initially, I stamped this with my Distress Oxides. So these are all separate words that you can kind of create your own sentiments with. So I take my I use my grid mat to line these up, pop these on an acrylic block, and then just stamp them on scrap piece of paper just to make sure they do appear that they're lined up correctly. I stamped the first part of my sentiment with the stormy sky to kind of get a tone on tone look. And once I stamped it, I realized it blended in way too much with the background. So I tried to brighten that up a little bit by stamping the second part of my sentiment with the salty ocean, and that looked even worse. So I walked away from that for a little bit and worried about my images while I decided how I was going to fix that sentiment. I knew it was going to dry back a little bit. So I arranged my little characters here, and then I will pop all of these up with some Scotch foam tape, and then realized that I'm probably going to have to completely cover up that sentiment. I still wasn't liking it at all. So I took a white piece of cardstock. This is just from my scrap bin. I'm going to treat this with my anti-static tool, and I'm going to stamp my sentiments again with that same Stormy Sky Distress Oxide ink. Luckily, I still had them aligned on my acrylic block, so I didn't have to worry about doing that again. Distress Oxides stay wet for quite some time, so you can easily heat emboss with these. So I'm going to sprinkle on some Hero Arts clear embossing powder and go ahead and heat set this. Then I'll cut these down into little strips to pop up onto my card panel. For the top part of my sentiment, I just left this as a skinny little strip. And for the bottom part where it says warm and cozy, I ended up fishtailing both ends of this little sentiment strip. And then I will pop these up with that same Scotch foam tape right directly over the area that I had stamped initially. And I wanted to create some snow in the background, and you can certainly use the stamps that are part of the stamp set for the snowflakes. But I had already added my sentiment, so I didn't want to have to go around those. So I just took a white gel pen and just added dots all over my sky. And it was pretty easy to go around the sentiment, but you probably should do this before you pop that up. Last, I added some shimmer to some of the hats and scarves and presents. And that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.